Hi everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If you can you give me like a wave or just shout? That's okay in the chat. Brilliant. Okay, we'll just give a few more minutes for for more people to join, and then we'll get underway. Okay, fantastic. Let's get started. Hello to everyone. So this is the session on discovery and understanding your Tech for Good project. I'm Steve Hawkes. Hello. And I'm the managing director and one of the co-founders at the Developer Society. We're a not-for-profit digital co-op. And I think we're the world's first for our shape, where we're run and owned by the third sector. So it's really exciting to be able to have this opportunity to kind of share with you about discovery. We work with all sorts of non-profits and charities, from groups like Oxfam and Samaritans through to local and regional smaller charities, and have a lot of experience in trying to help people in that sector navigate the complexities of digital projects, and hopefully get towards their goals and aims. And what I'd like to do is share with you some stuff about discovery today as part of that. So I guess some housekeeping to begin with. Everything on the session is going to be recorded, so don't worry about notes or anything like that. I can share the recording after the session. Definitely be able to give you all my slides, and there's a few links and things that will be useful, so those will come around. And there are some resource links and references to canvases and different things that I can kind of give you links to. So again, don't feel you have to scroll for those, they'll follow the session. So yeah, there's the chat for those of you that may or may not have used Zoom before. A lot of people are largely familiar with this now, but in the icon in the middle, if you want to shout out, that's there, and I'll do my best to try and follow the chat and talk and kind of go through slides at the same time as I'm running solo today. So in terms of what we're going to do, I've got a short presentation, won't be more than 15 minutes. And because it's about discovery, I'm really keen that we get onto Q&A, so we can really dive into what you want to know about discovery and make this about you rather than about me. And I'll be sharing some links, some good resources that I think are good ways of shortcutting some discovery process and getting to some good outcomes quickly. So hopefully they'll be useful too. So what are we talking about here? So really this session for me is about trying to give people an understanding of what discovery is, what's in it, what it does, why to do it, and also to largely hopefully give you a sense of confidence around this. I think there's so much that surrounds digital projects with buzzwords and obfuscating things that could be simple but are made to be very complicated. So I hope by the end of this session you'll kind of feel a lot more confident in navigating those buzzwords and that you can run discovery potentially yourself. But if this is about discovery, then it would be really bad if I then just assume everything about you and then tell you all the answers. I should really start with some discovery myself. So I thought I'd ask why you're here. So I'm just going to ping around a quick poll that should pop up for you, just to kind of get an understanding of where you're at. So there should be a screen that pops up that gives you some options to respond. So one of the questions I wanted to ask was, what's your experience of discovery? Are you completely new to this as a topic? Or is this your job and you're just here to catch me out on kind of something I might say that's wrong? And then secondly, how confident are you? Like, do you feel this is completely obvious, or is this completely new as a topic? So it's kind of interesting results. So we've got some people, the majority are knowing a little bit or nothing. So I'll give a couple of more people a couple extra seconds to vote to get those in. A few people do know lots, so that's good to see. You can kind of hold me to account in the QA. I'll expect those kind of wonderfully awkward and complex questions in the QA section later on. And in terms of confidence, we're seeing kind of middle to low. So most people on 2 stars, which is great. There. And then just so you can see that, that's how the results came out. So lots of people with a little knowledge. So hopefully we can build on that today. And lower confidence, again, that really maps with what I was hoping to do this session. So I feel like we're all in the right place, which is great. Okay, so let's start with why discovery in the first place. Why does this need to be a thing? For me, tech for good projects have a really bad reputation for failing. And when they don't fail, they're generally described as more like fizzling, so they don't quite achieve what they were set out to do. And that's often not necessarily the fault of the technology itself. That's an element thing. It doesn't do anything. It's more to do with the decisions and the goals that we set for that technology were maybe misaligned with what they wanted the project to be, or didn't quite deliver the impact we hoped for. There was some misalignment, mismatch with what was delivered and what was hoped. So discoveries can help with that. Tech has become much faster as a beast. So you can spin up a website in hours and kind of get something online. You can start a digital service in a couple of days. We've got things like Google Design Sprints running processes to prototypes in 5 days or weeks, depending on your kind of flavor of sprint that you do. And because we're now faster, kind of working out which direction you're running in makes a lot a bigger difference, because if you're going further faster, the minor errors in which direction you're running in have a bigger impact in terms of where you end up. Also, this is a focus on tech for good. Tech for good projects are often budget constrained way more than their kind of for-profit commercial sector counterparts. And so there's less margin for error to begin with generally. We don't have often the luxury of like a heavily profit-funded model supporting what's being done. Things are often done at a loss, and so the shoestrings are shorter, and so we have to be really smart with the use of time. Discovery can help with that. The media landscape has changed. So when I first started out in digital, which is about 12 years ago, I think I was starting running digital projects. The media landscape was really different. Often website launches were linked with newspaper press releases. And so the launch moment was a really significant time. Whereas now we're starting to learn and realize that people search for you on Google, and what is there is there. And so really it's that moment that's more critical for the impact of a lot of projects and services. And so the traditional shapes of maybe waterfall processes that would take a lot longer, but then result in this big launch moment, the value is shifted around. It's more like what is there for people at the time of need, and how can you improve that over time? And discovery can help shape that too. Projects are getting bigger, particularly in the third sector. There's lots of complexity. Often we're dealing with really complex needs from people. And the bigger and more complex something is, the more room there is for assumption and bias in that, which is why we sometimes get these kind of course correction errors in projects. And a lot of that comes down to accessibility. We're starting to catch up with now in terms of kind of language and what's commonly understood. But there's definitely a lot of unconscious bias in projects, unconscious bias in communication and briefing and things that can lead to some of these problems. And discovery can help with this dynamic. One of the things that's interesting is you can hear from users in the end, regardless of if you do or don't do discovery. So you're going to get that feedback from service users or stakeholders anyway. So you might as well lead with that and kind of get to that point earlier. So really discovery is there to help with all these dynamics. So it's kind of like a risk management process as I see it. It really helps you take some of the potential for pain out of a project. And hopefully has lots of other benefits that we'll dig into during the talk. So what actually is discovery? So for me, it really depends on your context. I think a lot of people are really fixed on what discovery is. And depending on who you talk to, largely if they're selling discovery, they have quite a strong opinion about this. I know we would have a particular take on discovery at Dev, but in an attempt to be neutral for you, I've heard lots of different ways of describing it. So I've heard people talk about discovery being a workshop. So it's something you might do as part of a web development process or working with a group, and it's maybe a time constrained session that has a certain format or design. And that could be one way of expressing discovery. Some groups describe it as a phase. So it might be part of a series of phases in a way of understanding a digital project or how a process would run in a wider context. So a good example of this is the Government Digital Service, who are quite kind of well known for their digital practice, is quite kind of recognised as being a good practice. They describe it as being a series within their project process for exploring the problem space, and that's how they do it. So maybe for them it's a phase. Some people say it's best practice, whatever that means, and it's like a better way of doing things. So maybe some people say it's a way of leveling up what you're doing. It's like an enhancement to stuff you might have already in place. Some groups say it's part of Agile. So it's the Agile kind of methodologies and things gets labeled like discovery is like a stage within that process specifically. And what's really interesting with all of these things is there's a lot of complexity there. So this is I don't know if this is real or just something I found online that isn't, but this seems to be like a Deloitte map for all of the different user-centric kind of buzzword-laden processes that you can do. And when I was looking at this, I noticed that 48 of them are kind of in a discovery space. So potentially there's 48 of these things that you could be labeling as discovery that may or may not match your definition of discovery. But I think this is part of the problem to why discovery can be confusing, is there's so many different people saying so many different things about what it is. It could be a philosophy for you. So you could say that you're maybe someone who's always learning and therefore discovery is part of that philosophy. Or maybe that's expressed like, say, for example, with CAST and a lot of their digital best practice that's really fantastic, where they have 10 digital principles that are worth looking at. I can give you a link to this at the end. And these principles talk about things that would be covered through a discovery shape of some kind, like being led by users and making sure you're meeting their needs and working with them throughout a project. And obviously, if you're doing that, you'd have to start with them at some point in discovery. So yeah, lots of different takes on what discovery could be in terms of a shape. And I think to a sense that they're all kind of right. And really in the third sector, we're doing so many varied things in different shapes that it's about kind of understanding which one it is for you and applying that correctly. So let me talk about maybe what's in discovery, and that might help you work out kind of how big or small or what the right way of expressing that could be in your context. So really a good starting point for what discovery is about understanding the problem, understanding the context. So if we're going to do something digitally, it's really good to understand why. So to do that, you need to understand what the problem is you're trying to solve would be. What is it that you're trying to address through this digital project, and what's the context for that? So one way of expressing that might be a problem statement. So you could talk about the trigger for needing this digital project. So what's the kind of context and what's the cause of it? So I've seen a lot of projects recently where that's COVID-19 kind of bringing impact and change, and because that's occurred, there's now a need and a problem. A problem statement is probably going to include your target audience and who's involved there. So because of COVID-19, we've got a group of beneficiaries that need something that you might be trying to address to the project. And then you might be looking then to start to understand what the measures of success are. So we need to help them achieve something or access something or negate a negative effect. So really getting clear on that problem statement is a big part of discovery generally. And there's lots of different shapes that takes, but that's a kind of core component there. If you can define it in a sentence, I find that's like it's not valuable in itself, because a sentence or a paragraph, what's the real difference if the clarity is there? But I think the exercise of trying to refine that really helps you ask some questions that can lead to some good conversations. So that's definitely one thing to try. Because the more detail and clarity you have on the problem, like we said earlier, the more clarity you have on the direction you need to be heading in with your digital project, the more likely you are to end up in that place of kind of impact, seeing the outcomes that you want to see. The second big thing I see in discoveries, and I think this is kind of a core principle, really, kind of building from that problem statement and understanding what you're doing, is having a definition of like a knowledge board, kind of knowns, unknowns, and things you kind of know in between. And really, for me, discovery takes lots of different shapes, but it's really trying to tackle this problem. So where there are things that you don't know about what you're trying to do, and there are things that you definitely know about what you're trying to do, you're trying to move those unknowns to knowns, and discovery moving is the process that does that. So for example, you might say, if we launch this new matchmaking funding service, will help beneficiaries access funds. But how much of that do you know? And how much of that do you think you know? And how much of that really is totally unknown until that launches? And then it's not necessarily that everything has to become a known, because there'll always be uncertainty, and particularly in the third sector, we don't always have a 6-month process to explore this, for example. But the more we can kind of move those kind of issues from unknown to known, the more clarity and context we're going to get to. There's often a research process in discovery, and that's maybe a facet for moving those issues from unknown to known. So you'll often see user research in different kind of guises, from surveys and user interviews. But there's other ways of doing that too. But really what you're trying to do here is build around the users, because if they're the ones who are evaluating the success of your project, the more you listen to them about what they define as being successful, the closer you'll be to that end definition from the start. And that's what's going to lead to that outcome you're looking for. Another thing in discovery that's really common is that it's a way to kind of understand pitfalls ahead of reaching them. So for example, one of your unknowns might be around which technology to use. And so you could have head off in a direction because an agency told you this was the right thing to build, the right tool to use. But because that was an unknown that you just carried into the project, that might have led you to a place where there was a blocker in the project or a problem that you then reached because of that. So using discovery as a way to kind of surface those quickly and then get your understanding, particularly as an organization internally, more clear, is a good way of bringing those to the floor and addressing them again before it's expensive to address them. Sometimes in discovery, you see prototypes, or you might see more formally documented requirements. So particularly, say, in the public sector, you might see things like government policy or other frameworks that are impacting the project. And discovery can be a way of you understanding how what you're doing interfaces with a wider whole. So that's something that often comes up, and maybe the prototyping is a way of testing some of those things within those constraints. You might have other requirements, such as a tech stack that you have to use, so maybe a particular technology, or has to build upon an existing platform. There might be other things there that kind of bring you constraint and clarity that you can uncover. One thing that's often missed out is really that discovery can be an opportunity to communicate. So where we've got lots of internal stakeholders, like generally someone reports to a boss in some dynamic, and discovery can be a good way of sharing outcomes. Like, this is what we've learned. We were uncertain about these things. Now we're more certain about these things, and this is the direction we're heading in. And discovery can be an opportunity to create some of that conversation internally. I've seen lots of groups use things like show and tells as a way of breaking down silos within an organization, sharing knowledge and learning, and helping other projects be more successful by avoiding the pitfalls that you've uncovered in discovery that you've run. It can also be a great way of engaging external stakeholders. So for example, blogging about what you've learned that beneficiaries need, or insights that you found and sector information that you've uncovered, is a great way of not only kind of making some noise, but also just helping everyone do better practice. Often gets overlooked because of time and budgets, but it's really, really valuable. And as a bonus that I sometimes see, one of the things that is good in discovery is you can use it as a way to kick the tires with an agency. So before you commit to that kind of 6-month or 6-year project with someone, having a really short discovery phase where you work with them on prototypes or helping them understand users and kind of building clarity and alignment together can be a great way of de-risking the actual commissioning of a digital project, because you can time box it. It can be a lot cheaper, If you don't like it, there's a great exit moment where you still have the learning, but you don't have to be wedded to that part of the rest of the project, and that's also valuable. Yeah, so those are the things that you generally have that I see a lot in discovery. When is it done as a process? So what does finish look like? What are the outputs? For me, discovery is done when you get to a tipping point in your confidence. So there'll be a certain amount of learning that's taken place, and suddenly you'll go from having lower amount of certainty, lower amount of clarity, less knowledge about what's happening, who's doing what, and what needs to be done. And that'll suddenly tip to, okay, like we all know what's going on. That's very, very clear. And that's obviously going to vary wildly based on different project contexts. But really, for me, I generally like to look for something new being learned, because if something new hasn't been learned, I think that should be a question as to why haven't we learned anything in this process. Now, it could be that you're just so empathetically in tuned with end users and the organization's goals that all your assumptions were correct, and maybe discovery just confirmed those. But I think those are really, really rare shapes of discovery process. Having helped deliver discovery for groups like Nesta and some of the work we're doing with Catalyst at the moment, it's almost a certainty in the discoveries that I've seen that you will uncover something that's almost a big project problem. There'll be like a new insight or a big kind of moment we have to pause and think about what's going to happen as a result. But those conversations generally lead to much better outcomes, and sometimes savings in like project scope and effort as well, which is great. Another way that discovery can end is when you decide that you're ready to proceed. So you can say, great, we're now ready to go on with the project. So that's a good way of measuring that you've done the discoveries, that moment feels ready. So you've learned everything you need to know, and you're now super clear about what needs to be done. Let's now proceed and go build the thing, or the prototype worked great, we just need to roll it out now. Like those kind of moments will happen, and you'll be ready to move on with the project. But also you might decide that you're not ready to proceed, and that's also an outcome of discovery that you should really be open to as you go into it. Sometimes you will learn from the research that this was just a bad idea, and this is an amazing return on investment in that not wasting all that money and effort pursuing the wrong path is now what you get as an output of discovery. It's really terrifying as an outcome. I understand particularly why in the third sector this is something that people kind of like to nod and smile along with because it sounds really good. But when things are linked to funding or other kind of org internal goals, it's really hard to admit that this is an outcome. But the more we can do culturally to share that this is okay and that maybe there's a pivot required, I think the more we can reduce that scenario that we see with lots of tech projects failing. I think until we really grapple with this as a sector, I don't think we'll see as much impact as we'd hope for. But yeah, I think what we are starting to see is funders are slowly aligning with this. So I think there's a few more progressive funders that are starting to see that actually spending the fund doing the wrong thing doesn't lead to the outcome that the people who are in charge of those funds want to see. So it is actually beneficial for them too in allowing those pivots. So we're seeing Comic Relief and others kind of have a really good attitude to kind of these uncovered discoveries, and are sometimes baking them into the grant process now, which is interesting to see. Yeah, so user needs and empathy and insight, these are kind of things that you generally see as an outcome. So you'll generally have some form of understanding of what the users need, so who they are, what they want to achieve through this digital project, what their goals are, how that aligns with your goals. There'll be some kind of clarity around user need. I hope that you'll get more kind of empathy and insight through the process. So you'll have assumptions about what users need, but by talking to them, you just naturally have more human connection with people. And that does lead to a bigger sense of empathy, particularly if you're really smart with how you select the user you're working with. You can often tackle lots of things like accessibility and inclusion and diversity by working closely with the users, and that can bring lots of benefits to a project. There'll often be more clarity on what needs to be done. So you might have had that problem, but now you're closer to solution, and that can be great. And yeah, hopefully by the end of discovery, you'll start to get an idea of who does things from that list. So for example, you might say we need a piece of software building, or we need some design work doing to communicate something, or we need maybe a user researcher to do something more in depth because we've hit a problem and we don't know how to answer it. So it should start to point towards people as well as solutions for your project. One thing I would say, particularly in the third sector, is there's definitely a scenario where people just run out of steam in discovery, like the budget is used, the time has gone, and then you get this moment of like, we haven't fully uncovered everything, what do we do? What I would say though, when that does sometimes happen, the best thing to do is roll all of that into the next stage. So if you take the GDS model, you would go from discovery into an alpha. So maybe if there is uncertainty that you're carrying, put that into the alpha explicitly as part of the brief and the context, and then address it in that next stage, rather than just saying everything's okay and kind of smoothing over the bits that you don't like. Because again, you can maybe catch it at another stage in the process, and that might help you manage the risk in this project. So yeah, maybe that understanding becomes a brief in some form to a digital agency, or here's the problem, we know there's these pitfalls, we're not sure about these bits, help us through. Can be a really great way of kind of building a good partnership from the start. So briefly, then, how do you do discovery? Again, it depends which book you read. So these are just 6 different models that I found really quickly on doing some form of digital discovery process as part of a wider digital project. And you can see there, like design thinking, double diamonds, Google Design Sprints, the human-centered design process, all very beautiful, but all essentially have very similar common elements when you break it down. So try not to get lost in the jargon here. But I think there's some common themes that would be good to share about what it is actually that these systems and processes are doing. One of them is just really about understanding your confidence and understanding how that changes over time. So you start off feeling super confident, but having lots of assumptions, so low clarity. But as you go through, you'll become less confident as people start to challenge your assumptions and say maybe this isn't the right direction, or you'll hear different feedback that'll make you rethink. So confidence goes down. But at the same time, you're hearing what the user actually wants. Your clarity goes up. And really all those different processes seem to have some flavor of this, whether they draw it differently or they have exercises that flow differently. They're all kind of managing confidence and clarity and understanding in different ways, and designing steps to kind of move you from one state to another in different parts of the project. So just be aware that changes over time, and that's natural for whatever flow you're doing. There's lots of things where there are cycles and pivots in this process. So for example, you have a place of understanding a context, you might do some research that brings you to a new place, which might require you to go back and do more research. So they generally allow for some state of like repetition or pivoting or iteration in their process. So that's really common. They all take different amounts of time. So from a workshop in a day, and when that's kind of more of like a discovery session briefing into a prototype, say, if you're going to plan to put all your risk into the prototyping rather than into a research, then that might be one shape. Well, there might be a 6-month discovery process that you shouldn't, move forward before you completed. That's also common. So you just have to understand which time frame works for you, what your context is. The workshop might get you feeling prototype ready. So one of the things that we generally see is as doing research, you generally get dragged towards doing a prototype. That's quite common. And that's also because in agile principles, say, you would naturally be trying to move as close as you can towards the user and towards failure and towards more understanding, which naturally moves you towards a finished product. So a single workshop might get you there. That might be start off with let's kind of paper prototype, and that's the first thing you do. But similarly, that longer process might get you there too. So in summary for all that, it is just there's a solution somewhere, you're starting off with problem, and really discovery is trying to get you as far along that journey as you can. That's really the pattern. And then that MVP knowledge board, kind of the minimum viable way of expressing a discovery process for me is a knowledge board. So things you know, things you don't know, and then moving things in between. So we're doing a process at the moment with Catalyst, helping 8 groups through discovery and some user research. So depending on your definition of discovery, we're kind of blending a few different parts of that process. And this is one of the boards that we shared in Miro for helping navigate things. So you can see there where there are things that start off being unknown, and we kind of have groups moving the post-its kind of as they progress through their process. There's lots of things you often see come out in discoveries as well, beyond that kind of minimum viable. I think if you don't have some knowledge that you're evolving, you're possibly not discovering anything. But some common shapes that really do come out very regularly are understanding like outcomes. So not just the measurement of the problem, but trying to define solution. Metrics are a good way of kind of getting into this. So what does good enough look like? What does not good enough look like? We receive a lot of briefs, for example, where there might be a requirement to increase conversion, but people are hesitant to say what increase is required and what increase isn't good enough. That's often because we just don't know what's possible. So maybe discovery can help you refine some of those things, or at least be clear about what you don't know. Prototypes I've touched on, but they're really common as something you would do in discovery. So take something intangible and make it tangible as quickly as possible. And really that's done to unlock feedback. So how can we get to that clarity and insight? And I've mentioned that really does pull you through the process. So while it'll be natural to get closer and closer to final, so you can get kind of the most real feedback you can get, try not to rush that process because you might be missing different bits of insight there. You see a lot of user interviews and surveys as part of discovery. They're a great way of getting that direct feedback. Surveys are great for volume. User interviews are great for precision and really understanding more succinctly what someone needs. Often groups get really put off by user interviews and surveys and user research because it's a broad field, and there are some organizations that that's what they do. And so there's a lot of depth that you can potentially go into there. But to try and mystify some of that, really you can get a lot of insight from just 5 well-structured conversations with the end user. What we find is after that, you seem to get a lot of repetition of themes and maybe lots of nuance. And I'm not saying it doesn't add value to do more, but you can definitely get a lot of clarity and a lot of progress from just a few short conversations. And there's loads of advice and resource out there for like structuring a well-defined user survey that removes bias and handles those things. So it's definitely worth spending a little bit of time to look into that for sure. You might then see something that looks like user stories in a discovery process. So as that definition is coming out of what users need, who they are, often user stories is a way of containing that. So I'm a user, what is it I'm trying to do? And what does that enable me to do as a goal or outcome? And that's a great way of containing all that knowledge and particularly passing it between groups in a way that's very accessible. So it's definitely worth looking at user stories and user personas as ways of better understanding users through discovery. Sometimes in discovery, you'll see data. So you might, for example, have statistics on your current website, which parts are working, which parts aren't. So sometimes there's a data analysis side to what you're doing. It doesn't replace the human input, but alongside it can be really valuable. And in the third sector, there's often way more than that you need to uncover. So you might need to be able to discover how to make your offering sustainable, how to make funder requirement met if there's certain metrics you need to record or meet as part of your process. You might be needing to discover how to get through some of those things. You also might need to really understand where your time and budget is going to go in the project. So sometimes you see project planning coming into discovery in different forms. And again, all of this all seems to lead then to that kind of sense of learning, certainty, confidence, and a willingness to continue in the project or not, I suppose, is the outcome. So again, all those different exercises that you might find when you look at discovery, that's all what they're trying to do is kind of make sure we don't fail later on. One way that I've kind of seen discovery outcomes framed that's quite useful is by thinking about what the brief should be. So after the talk, I can definitely share like our briefing canvas that we use with partners. And then sometimes if you have a set of empty boxes to fill, that can help you understand what unknowns you might have in your project that can help guide you onto what you need to uncover through discovery. So briefing is one way of like maybe measuring a discovery outcome. So hopefully by now you realize that I talk fast and I've gone through a lot very quickly. But how can we kind of make some of this more accessible to you? So I thought I wanted to share a few things that could be useful to check out. So Digital Candle is a great service. There's lots of digital experts from lots of different agencies and freelancers that are volunteering time just to jump on a call, have a coffee with someone that's working on a digital project and help unblock them. And those experts come from all different stages and different facets of a project. So if you need help with understanding discovery or you have some specific questions, it's a great place to go. Get on a call for half an hour. You can kind of chew the fat with someone that might give you some extra context and insight. So I definitely recommend that. We've been volunteering some people on our team for a while, and it leads to really great conversations. It's kind of low risk for both sides. It's a really great idea. Design hops are worth looking at too. These are from Cast as a Shape. And they're really great at taking you from getting a clear definition of your problem statement, some of that knowledge board work, and then getting to a place of understanding what it is you would need to test through user research. So if you need that part of the process covered, design hops are a good, well-formed shape for doing that. And of course, digital partners are there to help you through some of this. So whoever would be doing the future stage of your project process should be able to guide you into good ways to have your digital project supported. Okay, so those are like 3 common avenues for getting support that I've seen work really well. That's enough of me like talking at you at speed. It'd be great to open up to questions. So in the chat button at the bottom, if you do have a question, I'd much rather now dig into what you want to look at for discovery. And I'll take some time to try and answer some of those while we're together. I really do thank you for letting me kind of run through all those slides, and hopefully that gives like some grounding and covering as to what discovery is. Great, okay, so the first question that's come in is, what's the difference between a pilot and discovery? That's a really good question. So I guess I've been using the word prototype so far in the talk. I think it depends on what it is that your unknown is in your project. So for example, you might be trying to discover if there is a need for your service, in which case you might not want to go ahead and build a whole prototype of that service just to understand that part of your project. But if you have quite a clear definition, you're quite high confidence on what is required, a pilot or a prototype would be a good way of getting the understanding to the question, will this work? And so then the closer you can get to a working thing will give you the most insight into will that thing work. So I think discovery really can contain things to do with pilots or not, is maybe how I can see them. So maybe discovery contains a pilot as part of a process. But like I said earlier, it depends on how you're defining your project stages and project process as to how they sit together. Let's see what the questions we've got. Rory, you've got a question. Let me see if I can unmute you. Flying solo today, so let me see if I can unmute. Does that let you unmute? See if that works, Rory. If not, I'll jump on to the next question. Do you have an example of what good discovery output looks like that you could share? Yeah, okay, so that's one of the things I can do. We've got some different canvases, and I can come onto a list of links that I can share in a moment. But after this, when we share the recording, I can pull together some links. We use Miro internally, so I can pull together some links for example canvases on Miro that can be good outputs of discovery. And I can also give you our briefing canvas, which, like I said, could be a way of measuring the kind of output you would need to know to start well with a good digital partner in more of a design and build process. So I can definitely share those. Tim, let's see what you asked here. Do you know if there's any organizations out there that do bread and butter platform solutions for collections of small nonprofits that are kind of customizable but templated and a supported approach? We don't use big providers. Okay, so this is a little bit more like how do we navigate the project? So yes is the short answer. The more tech evolves and the more, I suppose, agencies like ours are repeating the same project shapes and needs, the more this does become commoditized over time. And it seems like what you've discovered is that maybe having a commoditized approach to some of your tech would be useful. On commoditization, by the way, it's really worth looking up Wardley maps. They're a great way of understanding your tech landscape and understanding which parts of your organization you want to move towards commoditization or maybe towards more experimental processes. So it's definitely worth those look up on that topic. It's interesting. But back to this, Tim. So I think in terms of your question, yes, there are definitely pre-packaged solutions. So everyone would have heard of WordPress and things like that now can be deployed in a way that's very kind of isolated and packaged. And then templating is part of what they do. I think we're seeing a lot more prototyping through other platforms as well. So I'm seeing a lot of use for things like Typeform as a way to start an automation process to make a service that feels much bigger than perhaps that one component, particularly when you compare that these days with tools like Zapier, which is great for workflow automation, and things like Twilio, which can automate communications. You can create quite a lot of complex services by just putting those three things together in a complex way. And you're right, particularly when you're in discovery, you don't want to be tying yourself to a big commercial outlay. The more that you can fail quickly and cheaply by trying something out, getting some learning and building confidence, the more value you can get out. So absolutely. And maybe Tim, if you share more about the kind of things you can do, I could dive into some more detail about what could be useful there, but hopefully that gives you something on the answer. Yeah, Jeremy. So any more questions then that follow from there? Does anyone have anything else they wanted to ask? So one of the things I'll do cheekily now is to help me do some discovery. I've got a second quick poll just to see how this went. So in case you're thinking of a question, there's that survey. Oh, Rory, let me see if I can unmute you. Great.
Yeah, sorry, my mic wasn't working. So basically, I wanted to ask, like, I'm starting to start myself, and I don't have much experience in web development. And like in the past, like I've just used kind of freelancers on Fiverr or, you know, freelance websites, and you just kind of give them a brief and then they'll just get cracking on it. But then when I've started doing this and speaking to agencies and more kind of, you know, teams of people who do it for a living, a lot of the times, like in their quotes, they'll have like a discovery phase at the start. And I found like half the time that discovery phase is like the same cost as the actual development itself. I wanted to ask, like, I've been searching on your website and everything, so I'm guessing you kind of have the answers, whether it is like important to do that phase, because, you know, as a non-developer, I just think like, oh, I want this to work and this to work. Whereas I don't know if that phase of discovery is just a way for them to like make extra money, or really I should be focusing on that phase, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So I think for me, there's a few things there. One, it doesn't really, it's not really a requirement that you have to do discovery, right? So there's no rule somewhere that says if you don't do it, you're bad. But what we're saying is that if you don't do discovery, the chances that you might end up with the wrong thing are higher. So if you're, for example, working one-to-one with an organization and you're in the heartbeat of what's going on, and it's all very clear in terms of the briefing to you on what's needed, and the expectations are all 100% aligned, then it may be that the discovery isn't required. Maybe something has been discovered before to bring you to that conversation. I think what everyone's trying to do really is risk manage. So what's the risk involved in that project going wrong? So let's suppose there's maybe a misunderstanding in the brief, or maybe the project concept itself wasn't perfectly formed. What's the outcome of that event occurring? And so agencies, I suppose, have found discovery as a useful way to de-risk some of that process. So instead of spending, say, 2 months in development on that feature or thing that you've built, and then finding out maybe there's something that wasn't quite what you expected, or it didn't quite achieve what the organization wanted, discovery is just a way of doing that that de-risking process early on and making sure everyone's really aligned on what good looks like. And I think in terms of what you're saying for price and budgets, maybe that comes back to the point about timescale. So do you have to force everyone that you work with into a 6-month discovery process before you build anything? Probably not. But I'd definitely say it's worth looking at maybe like a 1-day discovery process workshop shape that might help you cover off some things that you might miss in a project brief. And that wouldn't necessarily have a massive sway on cost budgets or time for a project. Yeah. Hopefully that answers some of your question. Cool. It's really great to see 91% of people feel they've learned something new. And over half of you moved from kind of less than 2 stars to above 3. So I feel good about that. I'm happy to stay on here for a little bit longer. But if there are more questions, I'm really happy to dive into them. But while I'm waiting to see if anyone's typing frantically now. So those resources that I mentioned, these are just some things to signpost that I think are really good. And obviously, I can't really cover off in in half an hour, like the full discovery, kind of all the exercises and how you'd run them and all the facilitation of that. But just to give you a starter for 10 on some of these things. The Digital Candle link is there for those kind of one-to-one coffees with a digital expert. They're really valuable. They're free, and then definitely like recommend you dive onto some. The digital design principles from CAST are a great way of just understanding a good approach to digital products generally. There's lots of groups involved in forming those from across the sector. I think they cover off a lot of really good bases. The design hops, which is that first part of discovery, I think that's run as a one-day workshop originally, but I know with COVID that's pivoted to like a digital format, so I'm not 100% on the timings for those. But they're free workshops that you can get involved with. They'll take you through a good chunk of what you need in discovery, or at least get you to a place where you understand what to do next. We can help, and there's our web address for dev. If you're doing this solo and your question is maybe more around how do you facilitate this or take your team through discovery if you're doing it internally, then in terms of the beg, borrow, and steal, Miro has got a feature called the Miroverse, which is where they share the templates of canvases for those interactive whiteboards that Miro provides. And there's some great ones on there from groups like AJ and Smart that do have like discovery and ideation processes mapped out, user research, things like that, that you could kind of follow along if you wanted to. So that might be a way of you taking some risk out by doing some of that internally before you perhaps work with a digital partner. I've referenced the Google Design Sprint, so I put a link in for there. And afterwards, I'll definitely ping around some of the canvases and templates in the email to follow. I think that comes through digital leaders, but I'll send those resources on. Any more questions? So another one. What kind of movement are you aware of towards minimizing eco impact of digital cloud? How do projects go about minimizing carbon footprints on these services? There is a project that I've seen that lets you try and measure your website's carbon footprint. I can dig that out as a link and send that around after, but the name escapes me. But you typed in the web address of the project and it would tell you, based on how many assets were loaded and how long it took that page to load, how much of your computer was used to show that page. And it kind of converts that into a CO2 kind of grams thing. So that's one thing that I found was like a useful tool to start that conversation, because sometimes you see homepages like whizzy animations and lots going on, and like that does have a cost. It's just very invisible. So I really like the concept of that project for making some of that visible. A lot of big cloud providers are doing carbon offsetting as a way of kind of handling this, which is good, but I think it slightly muddies some of the issue a little bit. So I think obviously minimizing the impact is minimizing the use of electricity and the dependence on it, which would probably minimize the use of service. And that kind of comes at odds with what a lot of groups are trying to do, which is maybe increase the use of service over time. So it's tricky, is what I'd say. We're ISO 14001 certified, and like we review this kind of stuff internally at Dev. And I think you can pick providers that do have green policies and at least talk about how they're offsetting and doing stuff there. And I know there are some hosting companies where that's their USP, is kind of the way they do carbon management. I think there's probably some benefit in going cloud, probably from like economies of scale on energy usage, but I don't have much more beyond that to share, to be honest. Yeah, hope that was useful. Was there anything from anyone else? If not, we're doing really well for time, so I can stay. I can do like a mini digital candle for anyone that wants, or yeah, but also feel free to have some time back if you want. That's me if you want my details again. And I think you'll all get a follow-up email through digital leaders following this talk because you've attended. But yeah, and all the resources and links will hopefully be on there. But if there's anything I can help you with directly, just feel free to reach out and I'll follow up with you one-to-one. Giving that last few seconds to see if anyone wants to squeeze a question in. No, okay, cool. Well, I'm gonna stay on here on mute, but thanks everyone so much for joining. Hopefully this was useful. You really made my day with the survey results. I know this is a taster rather than the masterclass, but yeah, hopefully it starts a good conversations and we can kind of move you forward with that. So I really appreciate your time during the session. Thank you. Yeah, go discover something awesome. I'll catch you soon. Take care.